The last living segregationist senator made his much-anticipated return to the public stage the other day, and right on cue, without missing a beat, former alleged President Joe Biden immediately started talking about
colored kids.
Colored kids. And just so there's no confusion, that is a direct quote straight from the dead horse's mouth. Again, his words, ladies and gentlemen, and YouTube, not mine. In fact, if I'm being honest, I can't really imagine any future scenario in which I might stand in front of an audience at the ripe old age of 83 and wistfully recollect how much I enjoyed watching those colored kids go by in that school bus that one time. I mean, I guess we can assume the bus was yellow. What color were the children? Well, Joe didn't say. But whatever color they were, I am sure their hair smelled fantastic. So what do you think? Should we play the entire clip just to give him the benefit of the doubt so he can't say that we took him out of context? And sure, maybe when you're talking about Joe Biden, those concepts are mutually exclusive, but that's not important now. And so, we're going to have the same problem here that we often do with Joe Biden quotes, which is trying to figure out just what the hell point he is attempting to make, because even the people closest to him often have no idea. Here it comes.
And I was only going in fourth grade. And I remember seeing the kids going by at the time called colored kids on a bus going by. They never turned right to go to Claymont High School. I wondered why. Asked my mom.
All right,
why?
Pause in right there. So I think he's saying the black neighborhood was so dangerous that the white kids weren't allowed to walk through it to get to their Catholic private school? Which seems like a strange thing to open with, but then, who the hell am I to question the judgment of an alleged former president?
So in Delaware, they're not allowed to go to school, in public school, with white kids, honey. That sparked my sense of outrage as a kid.
So Biden's people, they had to issue a statement later on in the day, because of course they did, clarifying, for lack of a better term, that his actual intent, the message he was attempting so inartfully to convey, and I am not making this up, was that when he was little 9-year-old fourth grade Joey Biden, standing on that cold Scranton sidewalk in his little Catholic schoolboy uniform, looking like a little Angus Young, the sight of those colored kids, riding that segregated school bus, it lit such a moral brush fire inside of little Joey Biden's soul that he resolved right then and there, damn it, I, little Joey Biden, am going to become president one day so I can stop this from happening to any other little colored kids. And you'll notice this is a fun recurring theme in Joe Biden's invented childhood recollections, where between the ages of 8 and 11, he has this series of transformative experience that cause him to conclude that he needs to go to Washington and help the downtrodden. And who's to say whether being an unreconstructed segregationist was part of the plan all the way back to age 9? But can we dismiss it out of hand? I don't think we can. It is a vexing conundrum, though. I mean, if we're subjecting Joe Biden's made-up childhood recollections to any sort of basic intellectual scrutiny, and of course we are, it just seems weird that if you were so motivated at 9 and 10 years of age to go to Washington and be a heroic paternalist white savior for communities of color, I'm just saying, how do you get from that point A to the point B of running for the Senate at age 29 as a segregationist stooge for the insurance companies who doesn't want his constituents' kids going to school in a racial jungle? That is the journey I want to hear more about, by God. I was so excited to become an anti-racist senator that I became a racist senator. You know, it's really quite amazing that a man can still be alive, allegedly, and lucid sometimes in the year 2025, but still have such an imperfect understanding of how politics actually work now. Joe was the perfect politician for a world where there is no cable news and no internet. Because you can go into each town, tell whatever made-up bullshit story you want, go to the next town, tell a different bullshit story, and nobody will ever be the wiser. That's exactly how he made his first presidential campaign implode in on itself like a dying star. And it seems, even still today, that it would never occur to him that the bullshit story he's telling right now is incompatible with the bullshit story he was telling the other day, or that it all adds up to a story where Joe Biden was the most politically astute 9-year-old child since the 16th Dalai Lama. But that's it for Joe, because we need to talk about something more pressing. Because the race huckster left thinks it has founded the four-leaf clover of the race huckstering world, and that is another St. George Floyd. Except in this case, instead of being a career violent criminal and pistol whipper of pregnant women who expired from a drug overdose while he happened to be in police custody, the new St. George Floyd is a kid who brought a big fucking knife to a high school track meet and immediately plunged it into the heart of the first guy he had a trifling disagreement with. They always pick just the best people to rally around, just the greatest moral exemplars, don't they? From high top of the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where if I get a $5 super chat from China, does that mean after tariffs I get 7 1/4? Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And if you don't know the broad details of this story yet, well, you should probably pay closer attention to the world. But having said that, here it is in easy bite-sized chunks. Jordan Metcalf was a kid who went to watch a track meet. Karmelo Anthony is a kid from a different school who went to watch the same track meet. And for reasons that your mainstream fake news media seem disinclined to explore, he decided to bring a big fucking knife with him. Now, normally, when I'm gathering my little personal accoutrements that I need to go watch the high school track meet, big fucking knife isn't on the list. Even if it's a little kid soccer game and you're the parent who's responsible for distributing the freaking fruit slices, even if you have a legitimate, demonstrable need to cut up apples and oranges, you're still not going to be allowed to bring a knife anywhere near the venue, much less as a spectator. If you're a spectator at a high school track meet and you're a student at one of the schools and you bring a big fucking knife, I am unwilling to pretend I was born yesterday. I feel like the only reason for doing that is because you felt like you would like to find an excuse to stab somebody from a rival school. Which Karmelo Anthony, of course, did wind up doing, but only after he had gone and situated himself in a location where people from his school were not supposed to be. So if we are attempting to conclude just from the facts at 30,000 feet which of the parties was looking to instigate a physical confrontation, I'm going to say it was the guy who brought the big fucking knife to a high school track meet and then sat someplace he knew he wasn't supposed to sit, with the full knowledge that if he did sit there, he would be confronted about it, and then instantly plunged a knife into the chest of the first guy who did confront him about it, which, on this day, happened to be Austin Metcalf, who wound up exsanguinating in the arms of his twin brother, who was powerless to render any aid since Karmelo Anthony had just severed Austin's aorta. If this injury had been inflicted on the floor of a surgical trauma room, it probably would have made little or no difference. If we're talking strikes below the neck, this was just about as fast as a man can kill another man with an edged weapon. If you plunge a knife into a man's chest with sufficient force to sever his aorta and kill him in under a minute, you weren't defending yourself. That's not a reflex action to a man putting his hands on you. You had your hand on this weapon. You were looking for a reason to swing it. And once Austin Metcalf placed his hand on your shoulder, or whatever it was, it doesn't matter, you made the conscious decision to end his life. And when you saw what you had done, you ran away as fast as your feet would carry you, which is a strange reaction when you did nothing wrong and you were just defending yourself against a hand on your shoulder. Okay, dude. Sometimes the unwitting decision to flee says a bit more than we want it to, because me, personally, if I've just inflicted a potentially fatal injury on another man in the act of defending my own safety, am I going to run away? Hell no, I'm not going to run away. I'm going to render whatever medical aid to that man that's within my power to render, because the absolute last thing I want is for that man to expire right here on this floor. Because first of all, yeah, obviously, I don't want to be responsible for the death of another individual. And second of all, I need this man to remain alive so he can testify to the fact that he attacked me, and I was just taking reasonable measures in defending my own safety. And is either of those causes served by fleeing the scene and attempting to hide? No, they are not. Now, if you've been watching this channel for longer than 5 minutes, you already know that I'm generally not a big fan of the whole imagine if the roles were reversed game, but I think here we have a case where an exception has to be made, because, seriously, Just imagine what the headlines would look like on CNN and MSNBC right now if the fact pattern was exactly the same, but you just swapped out the races of the two parties. In other words, if this was a story about a white kid fatally stabbing a black kid through the heart because the black kid asked him to move to a different seat. First of all, let's call things what they are. You would probably have multiple cities on fire already, hundreds of homes and businesses consumed and burned to the ground. Second of all, you would have every single money-grubbing racial arsonist in North America on the scene, getting their much-coveted TV FaceTime, standing next to the family, doing all the press conferences. Al Sharpton and Ben Crump would have materialized out of the ether in under 5 minutes each, as they always do when they smell the sweet, sweet aroma of lucrative race grifting. And of course, you'd have to have at least 5 state funerals from coast to coast over the course of an entire week so that each region's race grifters can extract their pound of flesh and their 10 pounds of gold out of the deal. And what do we have instead of that? Well, amazingly, we're getting about at least 50% of it anyway, because how impossibly morally incoherent has our society become? How ethically bankrupt are the fake news media? How incapable are many of our supposed intellectual thought leaders of viewing human events through any other prism except skin color? Well, I think the answers to all those questions are contained within the following set of facts. Karmelo Anthony, the accused first-degree murderer, whose culpability in the crime is questioned by no one, he's had a Give, Send, Go fundraiser started on his behalf, which for some reason has been allowed to stay up, which originally was supposed to be just for legal expenses, but they've had to walk that back in the last day or two since, well, the moment he got released on his drastically reduced bail, which should not have happened under any circumstances. Karmelo has been hard at work preparing his legal defense by buying a brand new car and moving his family into what can only be described as a palatial mansion. In other words, if you're a black youth who murdered a white youth in cold blood, how does your society, the United States of America, treat you in return? Well, by buying you a fancy new car and $1 million house. And this almost feels like a desperate last attempt by the race grifter industrial complex to recapture the glories of half a decade ago, when they commanded legions of looters and arsonists and could use the implicit threat of further violence to extract any concession they wanted out of a terrified political and corporate establishment. I think it was in the summer of 23 when I made an episode of this very program in which I opined that, yes, I feel like we are passing peak woke right now at this very moment. We've crested the wave, the shark has been well and truly jumped, and it is all downhill from here. And it'll probably be a couple of years before we can look back and say, yeah, we had it just about right, but here we are, coming up on a couple of years later. And I have seen nothing between then and now that made me disinclined to stand by that assessment. So it's easy to see this Karmelo Anthony thing as a sort of final humiliating death rattle, like they had to try one last time to recapture the magic, and this case was the best thing they had to work with. Even though it's a case where you would have to be a literal crazy person, or a race-huckstering fake civil rights lawyer, but I repeat myself, to think there is anything remotely morally defensible about the action of the person who did the killing here. Even if you're bending over backward, tying yourself into the most fanciful intellectual pretzel shapes, you're still left with a young man who took another young man's life over a perceived slight. Over the kind of silly male posturing altercation that we all got into 100 times when we were in our teens. And 9 times out of 10, it would end with a bit of pushing and shoving. Once in a while, it might even escalate to throwing hands out behind the boll weevil. Worst case scenario, you might even take an ass kicking in front of your girlfriend. But nobody ever pulled out a goddamn knife and sliced another dude's aorta in half. Because adolescent male posturing, damn it, used to have rules. One of which was no stabbing the other guy in the heart. Shit, they even had that rule in Rebel Without a Cause, for Christ's sake. Slash wounds to the extremities are fine, but no stabbing in the torso, James Dean. We're going to do this like civilized people. So something happened in this young man's life that impelled him not only to bring a deadly weapon to a track meet, but to make lethal use of it over a provocation that can only be described as trivial at best. Does it have anything to do with the ongoing epidemic of black kids with no fathers? Does it have anything to do with a black popular culture that increasingly celebrates aberrant, violent, antisocial behavior and has for over 40 years now? Well, those are questions for another video, and whoever makes that video will probably get thrown off of YouTube. But here's another aspect of this story that might be the most disturbing one of all, and it's got nothing to do with scumbag opportunist left-wing race grifters. You see, Jordan Metcalf's father has tried to respond to this tragedy in the way that he thinks his faith demands he must. And that's by doing his best to be an example of Christian grace and charity. And just to reiterate, so the severity of the thing isn't lost on anybody, one of his twin sons was violently killed by a stranger and then expired in the arms of his other twin son. But a lot of people on the right primarily, including, amazingly, a lot of self-described Christians, they've been criticizing Mr. Metcalf for the fact that in his very first public statement, he said that he forgives the killer. And a lot of people have just lambasted him for that. Some of them quite viciously, and it was really a disgusting thing to behold. So disgusting, in fact, that I think it warrants being talked about here. First of all, never, ever presume to tell a grieving mother or father how they are allowed to act or what they are permitted to say. Because that person is the absolute last person in whose shoes you ever want to walk. Trust me on that. You owe them the basic decency of minding your tongue and shutting the hell up. Second, I feel really bad for Mr. Metcalf that he had to give a statement explaining how Christian grace and forgiveness actually work. But as a fellow member of that most terrible of all fraternities, I do admire his courage and his patience and his strength of character, because he stood up there and very calmly explained, which he shouldn't have had to do, that it's not his intent to say that his son's killer shouldn't be tried and punished to the fullest extent of the law. The forgiveness that he's granting, he's doing that for himself. He's doing that because if he doesn't do it, if he gives in to his natural desire for vengeance and recrimination, that desire will consume him. It will rob him of his ability to continue being a good husband to his wife and a good father to his surviving children. That forgiveness is the only mechanism he has for compartmentalizing in his own psyche all that stuff, for saying, I can set this thing aside. I can let God and the state of Texas be the ones who mete out the vengeance and administer the justice, and I can devote my energies to picking myself up off the deck and trying to figure out how to build a new life. And the idea that anybody, self-described Christian or otherwise, would begrudge this man that right, would castigate him for not doing the easy thing and giving in to vengeance and bloodlust, the correct adjective does not exist to describe how repugnant that is. And the veil of anonymity you think the internet affords you is no kind of excuse. Do better at being decent. Or if you can't manage that, then at least stop burdening others with your indecency. Thanks very much indeed for watching. Have a great day and a pleasant tomorrow. See you next time. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.